Stormboy Part 3. Hideaway and Stormboy spent the day fishing. It was fine and sunny, but somehow it seemed cold. Most of the time they just sat in the bobbing boat without talking. But Stormboy knew that his father knew what he was thinking. Sometimes Hideaway looked at him strangely, and once he even cleared his throat carefully, gazed out across the water, and said in an unhappy voice, "Well, I wonder how the three Mr. P's are feeling. As happy as Larry, I'll bet." He looked rather miserably at Stormboy and went on with his fishing. "Yes, I'll bet," Stormboy said, and also went on sadly with his fishing. Towards evening, they packed up and set off for home. The sun was flinging a million gold mirrors in a lane across the water. It glowed on the bare patches of the sandhills and lit up the bushes and tussocks till every stem and twig shone with rosy fire. The little boat came gliding in to shore through the chuckle of the ripples. Suddenly Stormboy looked up. "Look, Dad, look!" he shouted. Hideaway beached the boat and looked up to where Stormboy was pointing. "What?" "Look, look!" cried Stormboy. High against the sky, on the big sandhill, stood the tall lookout post that Hideaway and Fingerbone had put up years before. And right on top of the post was a big shape. It was quite still, a statue on a column, a bird of stone. Then, as if hearing Stormboy's startled voice, it suddenly spread out two big wings and launched itself into the air. As it banked against the western sun, its beak and big black-tipped wings glowed in the shooting beams of light. For an instant it looked like a magic bird. Stormboy ran ahead, craning upwards, yelling and waving. "Mr. Percival, it's Mr. Percival! Mr. Percival's come back home!" It was a happy reunion that night. Even Hideaway seemed secretly glad that Mr. Percival had come back. "Yes, I suppose he can stay," he said, "as long as Mr. Proud and Mr. Ponder don't come back too. One pelican's appetite is bad enough. We can't cope with three." And although Stormboy loved Mr. Proud and Mr. Ponder too, he found himself hoping very much that they would stay away. And they did. As the days went by, they sometimes swept overhead or even landed on the beach for a while, but in the end they always returned to the sanctuary. But not Mr. Percival. He refused even to leave Stormboy's side. Wherever Stormboy went, Mr. Percival followed. If he collected shells along the beach, Mr. Percival went with him, either waddling importantly along at his heels or flying slowly above him in wide circles. If Stormboy went swimming or sliding down the sandhills or playing on the sand, Mr. Percival found a good spot nearby and perched there heavily to watch and wait until it was over. If Stormboy went fishing or rowing on the Coorong, Mr. Percival cruised joyously round him, with his neck bent back and his chest thrust forward like a dragon ship sailing calmly in a sea of air. Whenever he saw Stormboy anchor the boat, he came gliding in with a long skimming splash, shook his wings into place and bobbed serenely on the ripples a few yards away. "Oh, you're a grand old gentleman, Mr. Percival," Hideaway said, laughing. "You ought to be wearing a top hat or maybe a back-to-front collar and a pair of spectacles. Then perhaps you could give the sermon or take the Sunday school lessons." But Mr. Percival merely held his head on one side and waited for Hideaway to throw him a piece of fish or two or three whole fish to pop into his creel. Fingerbone and Hideaway were both glad that Stormboy had found Mr. Percival. "Better than a watchdog even," Fingerbone said. "Can't run much, but can fly." "You can chase after things like a dog," said Hideaway. "You watch." It was true. They first learnt what a good catcher Mr. Percival was when Stormboy was playing ball on the beach. It was a red and yellow ball that Hideaway had brought back from Goolwa. Once, when Stormboy threw it hard, it went bouncing off towards Mr. Percival. "Look out!" Stormboy shouted, but Mr. Percival didn't look out. Instead, he took 2 or 3 quick steps and snapped up the ball in his creel. Stormboy was horrified. He rushed up to Mr. Percival, panting. "You can't eat a ball," he yelled. "It's rubber, it's not a fish. Don't swallow it, you'll choke." Mr. Percival listened to him very seriously for a minute, with his head held a bit more to one side than usual, and his big beak parted in a sly smile. Then he stepped forward and dropped the ball at Stormboy's feet, just like a retriever dog. After that, Stormboy often had fun on the beach with Mr. Percival. Whenever he threw the ball, or a smooth pebble, or a sea urchin, or an old fishing reel, Mr. Percival snapped it up and brought it back. Sometimes he threw things into the water. Mr. Percival watched carefully with his bright eyes. Then he flew out, landed on the right spot, and fished the prize out of the water. Then Stormboy would laugh and clap his hands and rub his fingers up and down the back of Mr. Percival's neck. Mr. Percival always liked this very much. The only thing he liked better was a good meal of fish. One day, as Hideaway was watching them play, he had an idea. "If he can bring things back to you, perhaps he can carry things away too," he said. He gave Mr. Percival a sinker and a bit of fishing line. "Now take it to Stormboy," he said. "Off you go." At first, Mr. Percival didn't understand, but at last, after many tries, he dropped the sinker at Stormboy's feet. Both Hideaway and Stormboy clapped and rubbed the back of Mr. Percival's neck and gave him a piece of fish. Mr. Percival looked very pleased and proud. After that, Hideaway asked Stormboy to stand out in the shallow water, and they played the game again. Before long, Mr. Percival could take a sinker and a small fishing line, fly out to Stormboy and drop it beside him. But he always expected a piece of fish after each try. They played the game for many weeks, sometimes with Stormboy in the water and sometimes with Hideaway, until Mr. Percival could carry a fishing line and drop it into the sea without any trouble. Then, when there was an offshore wind from the north and the great seas flattened out suddenly, Hideaway went far out from shore and Mr. Percival practised carrying a long, long line to him. "It's wonderful," Hideaway said, laughing and clapping when he came back. "Now Mr. Percival can help me with my fishing. He can carry out my lines for me." And he scratched Mr. Percival's neck and gave him an extra piece of fish. "Mr. Percival, you're as clever as a Chinese fishing bird," he said. And then he laughed, and so did Stormboy, and Mr. Percival was so pleased with himself that he snickered and snackered happily for the rest of the day. As time went by, people began to talk about Stormboy and Mr. Percival. Picnickers and game inspectors and passing fishermen saw them and began to spread the story. "Follows him around like a dog," said old Sammy Scales in Goolwa. "It's crazy, I tell you." "I wouldn't have believed it," the postmaster said, "if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes." And by, many people did see it with their own eyes. For when Hideaway and Stormboy set off on their trips to Goolwa, Mr. Percival couldn't understand what was happening. He flew around and behind and ahead of them all the way until they began to get near the town, and then he landed and waited patiently on the river until he saw the boat starting off for home again. People used to hear about it and come to watch. "Just like a dog," said Sammy Scales. "Crazy, I tell you. Someday the whole world will hear about this." And then something happened that proved he was right. It was the year of the great storms. They began in May, even before the winter had started. Shrieking and raging out of the south, the Antarctic winds seemed to have lost themselves and come up howling in a frenzy to find the way. In June, they flattened the sedge, rooted out some of the bushes that had crouched on top of the sandhills for years, and blew out one of the iron sheets from the humpy. Hideaway tied wires to the walls and weighed down the roof with driftwood and stones. In July, the winds lost their senses. 3 great storms swept out of the south, the third one so terrible that it gathered up the sea in mountains, mashed it into foam and hurled it against the shore. The waves came in like rolling railway embankments right up to the sandhill where Hideaway and Stormboy lived. They lashed and tore at them as if they wanted to carry them away. The boobyalla bushes bent and broke. The humpies shivered and shook. Even Mr. Percival had to go right inside or risk being blown away. As night came on, Hideaway battened up the doorway and spread extra clothing on the bunks. "Better sleep now if you can," he said to Stormboy. "By morning the humpy might be blowing along on the other side of the Coorong." In the darkness of early morning, Stormboy suddenly woke with Hideaway's voice in his ears. "Quick, Stormboy," he said. Stormboy jumped up. "Is the humpy blowing away?" "No, it's a wreck," Hideaway said. "A shipwreck on the shore." Stormboy put on 2 of his father's coats and followed him out to the top of the sandhill. Daybreak was coming like a milky stain in the east, but the world in front was just a white roar. Hideaway put his mouth close to Stormboy's ear and pointed. "Look!" he yelled. "Out there!" Stormboy looked hard. There was a black shape in the white. Fingerbone was standing on top of the sandhill, holding on to the lookout post. "Tugboat!" he shouted. "Aground!" yelled Hideaway. Fingerbone nodded. "Storm too wild!" he bellowed. "Poor fellows on tugboat!" He shook his head. "Poor fellows!" When morning came over the world at last, they could see the tugboat clearly, lying like a wounded whale, with huge waves leaping and crashing over it, throwing up white hands of spray in a devil dance. "They can never swim it or launch a boat," said Hideaway. "Their only hope is a line to the shore." "No one get line out," Fingerbone said. "Not today." "No," Hideaway said sadly, "and by tomorrow it'll be too late." Sometimes in a lull between the waves, they could see 3 or 4 men clinging to the tugboat, waving their hands for help. "Look at them," Stormboy yelled. "We must help them or they'll drown." "How can we help?" said his father. "We can't throw a line, it's too far." "How far is it?" "Too far, 200 or 300 yards at least." "No black fellow throw spear that far," said Fingerbone. "Not even half so far." "Especially not with a line attached. We'd need a harpoon gun." "Then I couldn't throw a stone a quarter of the way," Stormboy said. He picked up a pebble and hurled it towards the sea, but it just fell near the shore. "See," he said. Suddenly there was a swish of big wings past them, and Mr. Percival sailed out over the spot where the pebble had fallen. He looked at the foam of the waves for a minute, as if playing the old game of fetch the pebble back. Then he changed his mind, turned and landed back on the beach. Stormboy gave a great shout and ran towards him. "Mr. Percival! Mr. Percival is the one to do it. He can fly." Hideaway saw what he meant. He raced back to the humpy and found 2 or 3 long fishing lines as thin as thread. He tied them together and coiled them very carefully and lightly on a hard patch of clean sand. Then he took a light sinker, tied it to one end and gave it out to Mr. Percival. "Out to the ship," he said, pointing and flapping. "Take it out to the ship." Mr. Percival looked puzzled and alarmed at the idea of fishing on such a wild day, but he beat his wings and rose up heavily over the sea. "Out to the boat! Out to the boat!" they all shouted. But Mr. Percival didn't understand. He flew too far to one side, dropped the line in the sea and turned back. "Missed," said Hideaway, disappointed. "But it was a good try," Stormboy said as Mr. Percival landed. He gave him a piece of fish and scratched his neck. "Good boy," he said. "Good boy, Mr. Percival. In a minute we'll have another try." But they missed again. This time Mr. Percival flew straight towards the boat, but didn't go out quite far enough. "Never mind," said Stormboy. "You're a good pelican for trying." He held Mr. Percival like a big duck and gave him another piece of fish. Again and again they tried, and again they missed. At first the men on the boat couldn't understand what was going on, but soon they guessed and watched every time, hopefully and breathlessly. Stormboy and Hideaway were disappointed, but they didn't give up. Neither did Mr. Percival. He flew out and back, until at last, on the 10th try, he did it. A great gust of wind suddenly lifted him up and flung him sideways. He threw up his big wing, and just as he banked sharply over the tugboat, dropped the line. It fell right across the drowning ship. "You've done it! You've done it, Storm Boy!" Hideaway and Fingerbone shouted together as Mr. Percival landed on the beach. "You're a good, brave, clever pelican," and they patted him and fed him and danced round him so much that poor Mr. Percival couldn't quite understand what he'd done that was so wonderful. He kept snickering and snackering excitedly, opening his beak in a kind of grin and eating more fish than he'd ever done before. But the struggle to save the men on the tugboat was only just beginning. The captain seized the fishing line as it fell, waited for the next big wave to roll past, and then fastened the line to the end of a long coil of thin rope. Gently, very gently, he lowered it into the sea and waved to Hideaway and Fingerbone to start pulling. They had to be very careful. If the line snagged or if they pulled too sharply, the line might break and they would have to start all over again. But they were lucky. At last the rope came lifting and flopping slowly out of the backwash. Fingerbone ran down to grab it. He danced and waved excitedly. Now the captain of the tug tied a heavy line to the thin rope, and the crew kept paying them out together, holding on desperately as the big waves and spray kept smashing over their ship. Before long, Storm Boy, Fingerbone and Hideaway had hauled the end of the big rope ashore. Then they dragged it quickly up the sandhills to the lookout post, where Hideaway wound it firmly around and round the butt. Meanwhile, the crew had fastened their end and had hitched a rough kind of bosun's chair to the rope. A man lashed himself in and signalled to Hideaway to start pulling on the thin rope. The rescue was ready to start. The sea sprang and snatched at the man on the rope like a beast with white teeth. Sometimes, where the rope sagged lowest, the waves kept him right under. Storm Boy could feel the shock and shudder of the line as the wave thundered around it. But the man managed to snatch a breath between waves, and he always rose up safely again on the rope. Hideaway and Fingerbone pulled until their feet dug deep in the sand and their muscles stood out on their arms. At last they were able to pull the man and haul him through the thud and tug of the sea to the shore, where he unfastened himself and dropped down onto the sand of the beach. He was shivering and exhausted, but he was safe. Storm Boy ran down to help him up to the humpy. Meanwhile, the rest of the crew had hauled the rough bosun's chair back to the ship, and another man was ready to be pulled ashore. After him came a third, who staggered feebly up the beach. "Hurry," he said, "the boat's breaking up and there are still 3 men on board." Hideaway's forehead was wet and Fingerbone puffed as they dug their feet into the sand and hauled. "Hurry," they kept panting, "the boat's breaking up." At last they had 5 men safely on shore, and there was only the captain to come. Then he too left the ship and they hauled again. He was a big man who weighed down the rope, and Hideaway and Fingerbone were almost exhausted. Suddenly the rope grew taut, shuddered and slackened. "Quick," Hideaway cried, "she's shifting." Storm Boy seized the pulling rope and hauled. "Hurry," yelled the captain, "she's going." 1 or 2 of the crewmen who could still walk grabbed the line and helped to pull. Between them all, they slowly hauled the captain ashore and dragged him, pale and half drowned, onto the beach. "Saved," he kept saying weakly, "saved by a miracle and a pelican." Hideaway and Storm Boy kept the captain and his 5 men in Humpy for a day. They gave him some hot food and dried out their clothes. Next morning the storm began to clear and the sun flashed across the Coorong, so Hideaway began preparing to sail the 6 of them to Goolwa. Before they left, the captain took Hideaway aside. "You saved our lives," he said, "you and your friend, and especially the boy and the bird. We want to do something in return." Hideaway was embarrassed. "No need to worry about that," he said. "But we've talked it over," said the captain, "and we've decided. We'd like to pay for the boy to go to school, to boarding school in Adelaide." Hideaway was sad. He'd be very lonely, and so would I. His heart would be sick for the wind and the waves, and especially for Mr. Percival. No matter, the captain said. He's 10, or is it 11? Soon he'll be grown up, and yet he won't be able to read or write. It's not right to stop him. Hideaway hung his head. Yes, I know you're right. He ought to go. But when they called Stormboy and told him the captain's plan, he wouldn't go. No, he said, horrified. I won't leave Mr. Percival. I won't. But Stormboy, not unless I'm allowed to take Mr. Percival to school with me. You know you couldn't do that. Then I won't go. The captain shrugged. Very well, he said to Hideaway. Later, perhaps. There'll always be a place ready for him. Then he said goodbye and scratched Mr. Percival's neck. You're a big, wonderful bird, he said. He looked up at Hideaway. When he dies, you must send him to the museum. We'll put a label on the case. The pelican that saved 6 men's lives. Hideaway looked round quickly. He was glad Stormboy hadn't heard the captain's words.